A World War II row triggers a trade dispute in 2019. Japan and South Korea remain at loggerheads over the forced labor controversy of more than 70 years ago. So why has it come to the fore now, and how can it be resolved? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly Thibault. A rift is deepening between South Korea and Japan over what happened during the Second World War. Japan, as occupiers of the Korean peninsula, forced Koreans into work. The issue has always stirred up deep emotions, but tension has recently escalated. A South Korean man set himself on fire outside the Japanese embassy in Seoul on Friday. His death followed Japan's ban on some exports to South Korea, imposed after a court ruled that Japanese firms should compensate the victims of forced labor. Japan's foreign minister summoned the South Korean ambassador when Seoul rejected a proposal for arbitration with a third country.
It's very regrettable that an arbitrator or third country arbitration has not been set up. In addition, I strongly urge the South Korean government to take immediate steps to correct this violation of international law.
That drew a strong response from South Korea.
It was Japan who violated international laws by committing unhumanitarian illegal acts. Our Supreme Court ruling pointed out that fact. Also, Japan has continued to demand a resolution of this issue through arbitration to settle problems concerning property and claims, but we never agreed with the unilateral deadline set by Japan.
So how did we get here? Well, relations between the two countries have been fractious for decades since Japan occupied the Korean peninsula between 1910 and 1945. But things came to a head last year. In October, South Korea's top court ordered Japanese companies to compensate Koreans who were forced to work for Japanese occupiers during World War II. Japan said the issue had already been settled under a 1965 treaty and threatened visa restrictions and tariffs. Then, this month, Japan restricted exports of 3 chemicals vital to South Korea's electronics industry, citing national security concerns. So far, Seoul hasn't taken any countermeasures, saying it would raise the dispute with the World Trade Organization. But some Koreans are taking the matter into their own hands and boycotting Japanese products. Well, let's bring in our guest now for today's Inside Story. Joining us by Skype from Tokyo is Tomohiko Taniguchi, who is a special advisor to the cabinet of Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. In Hong Kong, Robert Koepp, director of the Economist corporate network. And by Skype from Stuttgart in Germany, Si-won Koo, who is a publisher of the Korean Exposé, an online news magazine that focuses on contemporary South Korea. Welcome to the program, gentlemen. Thank you so much for being with us. Mr. Tomohiko Taniguchi, if I could start with you in Tokyo. Japan said it's restricting exports to South Korea because of national security. What exactly are Japan's concerns, and what is at the core of this dispute?
These 3 materials that you cited are extremely important because they are potentially going to be used for dual purposes, one civilian, another military. Given the sensitivity, South Korea and Tokyo have made consultation mechanism at work. But one has to say that the hasty fashion that the South Korean customers have urged the Japanese to provide them with materials, ending up with a near breaching of the regime that we are all after. I mean, the South Korea and Japan are after. And that consists, arguably, a source of security concerns, as you mentioned.
Mr. Taniguchi, is the Japanese move to restrict exports from South Korea not retaliation for the South Korean court's ruling that allowed assets of Japanese companies to be seized and used to compensate victims of the wartime forced labor? Is that not retaliation?
These two are completely separate issues because the export control regime is strictly under the Japanese government decisions, and it is, as a result, by nature, a domestic decision, as has been the case with many other exporters exporting some sensitive materials to other countries, such as South Korea.
Okay, let's hear from Siwon Ko in Stuttgart. Mr. Taniguchi says the Japanese move is a separate issue. It has nothing to do with the court rulings in South Korea. Would you agree with that? What's deepened the tensions as far as South Korea is concerned?
Well, this is certainly the line that we have heard from the administration of Shinzo Abe, that the export restriction has nothing to do with the development in South Korea over what Japanese companies should do with regard to compensating victims or forced laborers during the colonial period. As far as the government in Seoul is concerned, and as far as the public is concerned, these two are completely related matters, and the timing is most extraordinary. In fact, the measure has taken the government in Seoul quite by surprise, and we have not really seen any official measure coming from the government yet. But of course, the situation only gets worse by the day. And unfortunately, the damage to the bilateral relations is going to be quite extraordinary.
Siwon Ko, Japan's position is that the issue of compensation was addressed in the 1965 treaty that normalized relations between the two countries. And so Japan already give millions, hundreds of millions in aids and loans to South Korea. Why is it coming to the fore now? What is the issue for South Korea?
We have to accept that there has been a significant change on the South Korean political landscape. 2 years ago, we had a new president elected, Moon Jae-in. And one of his campaign promises was actually to revisit the agreement between Japan and Korea to address the issue of comfort women. It was supposed to be final when the agreement was signed in 2015, but the public opposition to this was quite significant. The government currently in Seoul has taken a harder line on the issue, and they have maintained that they will not see what they perceive to be a turn by the Abe administration toward the more right-wing tendencies, not just over the issue of wartime crimes, but also over the issue of Dokdo or Takeshima, the rocks between Korea and Japan that have been disputed by the two countries for quite some time.
All right, Robert Koepp, let's talk about the economic implications of this dispute. The U.S.-China trade war has already resulted in quite a lot of negative shocks for Asian trade flows. Do you think this dispute between the other two big economies of the region has the potential to escalate into another trade war?
Well, it certainly has the beginnings of one, and it's worth pointing out that actually South Korea and Japan had been suffering from the impact of the U.S.-China trade war because they are very much integrated in this global supply chain, which is centered around China, or has been. And so when the tariffs are put on Chinese exports, in fact, it's South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, very significantly the high-tech area that feed into that. So they've already been suffering, and now they have this dispute brewing. I guess the one silver lining to this is the export controls involve a review period. So there's like a 90-day window from which the two sides might be able to reach some sort of resolution. But if there isn't a solution to the impasse, I'm afraid it could make a bad situation much worse.
Japan has said it may escalate measures in August. How far can they actually take this, especially given that Japan's exports have been falling because of the U.S.-China trade war, as you say?
Well, that's the interesting thing. So currently, when you look at these very specialized components, they represent about 1% of the value of Japan's exports to South Korea. So things like hydrogen fluoride are very important to South Korean chip manufacturers and panel manufacturers, but they aren't very important to Japan's export base. But if indeed they start ratcheting up tension, not only will their own companies, of course, suffer as a consequence, just as, by the way, American companies and consumers suffer under tariffs that are just increasing the cost of inputs from China. But there's another factor that needs to be considered, and that is South Korea might start retaliating. And so, this is where you get what's known as a tit-for-tat trade war. And if things get more and more heated, the ramifications for those two economies and the global economy could become bigger and bigger.
Mr. Taniguchi, Japan says it may escalate the measures. Will it go as far as removing South Korea from its list of preferred trading partners?
Perhaps the list you just referred to is some list that listed 29 countries with which Japan has given blanket permission when it comes to exporting sensitive materials to the importers. But South Korea has been the only and sole nation in the entire part of Asia that Japan has maintained this arrangement over the last 15 years. European Union has given no such permission outright to South Korea. Japan has given no such permission to other members of Asia. So South Korea is going to return back to where it was, 2004. And in addition, no ban whatsoever, either about the 3 sensitive materials or in the future, other materials, is going to be imposed upon Japan's export. It's going to make the process slower and cumbersome, if you like. But that's the one any country is having with any other country.
Siwon-ko, the economic aspect of this relationship has been the glue supporting political cooperation between South Korea and Japan until now. To what extent are South Korea's domestic politics complicating the situation? And do you think there is a certain willingness domestically to improve things with Japan?
No, I would say this is very unlikely. The timing of the situation is most unfortunate because Korea already was feeling the pressure from the trade war between China and the US, and there was a lot of hand-wringing domestically over what the government could do to improve the business climate. And then came this move by Japan, and building on the existing anti-Japanese sentiment in Korea, which is very widespread, it's put tremendous pressure on the government to not yield to any demand by the Abe administration. The government has said it is open to diplomatic negotiations or compromise with Japan.
If they're open to diplomatic negotiations, as you say, why did they reject third-party arbitration?
Well, there is certainly the danger that if matter goes to a third party, South Korea might not get the ruling that it wants. It is also the case with the situation over Tokto or Takeshima, which South Korea effectively controls, and Japan has increasingly asserted that should be returned to its control. And Japanese have called for third-party administration, or at least a case with the International Court of Justice to resolve this. But this is an issue that South Koreans have not been interested in pursuing.
Robert Koepp, which side is suffering the most, and which side will suffer the most if this is not resolved, Japan or South Korea?
Well, currently it would be South Korea is more exposed because its manufacturers are so dependent on those specialty materials from Japan. It's worth pointing out Japan is not the only source, but it is the primary source. It has the right quality that these manufacturers rely on, and it's already integrated in their supply chains. However, it could be that Japan ends up suffering again if this starts to escalate. One thing that, for example, South Korea has that's very important to Japan is tourists. It's the second largest source of tourists to Japan after China, which, by the way, is another country where there's often these political flare-ups of a cultural, historical nature. So in that sense, the Japanese economy, which is increasingly service-based, is in fact exposed and could suffer.
Mr. Tanaguchi, as you heard there, if South Korea rather is not able to get its resources, the resources for its technology industry, is not able to talk to Japan, it opens the door to other suppliers like China, for instance, and this could backfire on Japan, could it not?
Because this is not for South Korea's, this is not based on the concerns about South Korea's domestic economy. It is about the Japanese domestic regime for export control. If indeed South Korean companies are going to find other sources, well, that's what South Korean companies should decide on, and that's totally up to South Korean companies. But when it comes to the export control regime, that the Japanese government administers. That is what the Japanese government is going to look after.
So what will it take for the Japanese government to roll back the export restriction?
The consultation mechanism is very much a linchpin for these two nations to push to continue having smooth, ongoing economic and trade relationships, especially about sensitive matters that could be put into dual use. But one has to point out that consultation mechanism has not been as working as the design of which urges these two countries to. And so that's something that both countries have to work on, but the ball currently is on the court of the South Koreans.
Okay, Siwon Ko, Mr. Tanaguchi says the ball is on the court of on the side of South Korea. What is it going to take for South Korea for the tensions to de-escalate?
Well, we hear about consultation mechanism or misuse of materials and all that, but ultimately everybody recognizes this issue comes down to how the South Korean government will address the key court ruling that has essentially exposed Japanese companies that had operated with Korean labor force during the colonial period to a potential compensation claims. And as far as the government in Seoul is concerned, it cannot really do anything. As I have said before, the public opinion is against Japan. It's against yielding to Japanese demands. And the kind of consumer boycott that was referred to by the commentator in Hong Kong, this is a very likely possibility. We're starting to see growing movement of consumers, which is not led by any particular interest group, calling for a boycott of travel to Japan, and also boycott of Japanese companies and Japanese products. And the rhetoric only starts to grow angrier by the day.
Right. So are you saying that there are political benefits domestically to continue down this road for South Korea, even though it hurts the country economically?
That's another way to see it. South Koreans also believe that Mr. Abe is doing this partly for his own political gain in the run-up to his own election. And at the same time, in South Korea, this can be of benefit to the government, which was suffering from a falling approval ratings. It is facing its own election campaign next spring, and it needed a cause to support, prop up support for its own party. And I am not saying that this is being done intentionally, but certainly it does play to the benefit of the current administration.
Okay, your response, Mr. Tanaguchi, before I bring back Robert Koepp into the conversation. Many in South Korea believe that the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is going down this road for political gain. What is your response?
Well, it may sound as if it is the case, but the truth of the matter is the decisions taken by the Japanese government of late about the export restriction or the strict implementation of the export control regime have been backed by 70–80% of the people polled. So it is not so much partisan as an issue. And I have to say that all those conflicts and differences of interpretation must be solved in accordance with the basic treaty that the two nations forged with each other. And there is a clearly written consultation and conflict-solving mechanism. And South Koreans' court and the government have chosen to pay absolutely no attention to the basic treaty. And the basic treaty has been the very foundation, legally speaking, upon which the bilateral relationship has flourished to the extent that you now see now. And one final thing I should say is that in the broadest context, Korean laborers could not find any other places to work for during the wartime. But the companies that employed those laborers paid money to those people. And those people who failed to get monetary compensation during the wartime were were able to get compensation from the South Korean government because in such a way, two nations chose to go ahead in 1965. But that chapter of history is being opened again and again.
Siwon-ko, I'll get you to respond on this question and issue of compensation in a second, but I just want to bring Robert back into the conversation and talk about the U.S., Robert, which says it has no plan to mediate between its two allies. Should they get involved, though? I mean, would it be not in the U.S. interest to try and broker some sort of agreement between Japan and South Korea, because this could play well into China's hand?
Your analysis is correct, but let's not forget what current U.S. administration we're talking about. The presidency of Donald Trump, regardless of what one thinks of the gentleman, is not known for its diplomatic finesse, shall we say. Granted, he has taken a personal interest in a certain Korean leader, and it seems to get along well with Shinzo Abe, and the U.S. has indeed a vital interest in seeing both Japan and South Korea get along, especially vis-a-vis China, as you mentioned. So maybe that will come about. Currently, the U.S. response has been, we want to stay out of it, but we want you to solve it. And they're hoping its two chief allies in not only Asia, when you think about it, but indeed, principally within the world, given the tensions that are going on both with China and North Korea. Certainly the U.S. must be thinking it would be great if this issue could be settled and have one less problem on the global sphere to deal with.
And how does the dispute benefit China and North Korea?
Well, it benefits both those adversarial powers vis-a-vis the U.S. viewpoint, because, in fact, you have, one, a distraction to other issues, and two, you don't have any sort of unified front. So North Korea, actually, more than any pressure from the U.S., has faced either some form of cajoling or attempt to bring a resolution to the issues across the 38th parallel from both Seoul and Tokyo. So those have been two principal actors in North Korea's position in Asia. Of course, the other key actor there is China, backing North Korea. The Japanese and South Korean interests have been trying to bring North Korea around to a more global way of thinking. But there's that. And there's also, again, just the fact that China can thrive in this atmosphere of divisiveness and play cards. It can either try to get better relations going with Japan or South Korea, or threaten either to its own ends. This divisiveness simply is not in U.S. interest or in the interest of its allies. So in that sense, it's benefiting adversaries more than allies.
All right, Siwon-ko in Stuttgart, you have the last word. Your response to Mr. Taniguchi on the issue, the question of compensation, and also what does it come down to as far as South Korea is concerned? Is it just an apology that South Korea wants?
Perhaps indeed, although the Japanese government will say apology has been given. We talk about compensation, and of course money is very important, but the heart of the matter is not money, it's about sincerity. The way that the Japanese government has maintained over years and decades that the matters of historical significance have been settled, this is what offends the sensibility in South Korea and more broadly in China and other parts of Asia as well. What Korean public wants to see is a kind of sincere apology and contrition, that the kind of which you often see from the German government with regard to its own wartime crimes. But this is certainly not what's been seen from Japan, and that's what really continues to fuel this kind of controversy.
All right, we'll leave it there, gentlemen. We've run out of time. Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. Tomohiko Taniguchi, Siwon-ko, and Robert Koepp. Thank you for being on Inside Story. And thank you as well for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can, of course, also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole Inside Story team, thank you for watching. Bye for now.